Obviously, Visa has such a unique view into the health of the U.S. consumer right now, the health of the U.S. economy. On one hand, you've seen an explosion in e-commerce, but also tens of millions of people who've lost their jobs, and we're in the middle of a recession. What are the trends you're seeing in U.S. consumer spend, and what are those trends telling you?
Well, first of all, Emily, it's great to be with you again. You know, the state of the consumer in the U.S. is in fact mixed between unemployment and the fact that we see travel categories like travel being severely depressed, and a lot of businesses are not back at 100% capacity, which is challenging for those businesses and in turn for the consumers that utilize those businesses. On the other hand, though, we have seen really almost a V-shaped recovery in consumer spending since the low point in the middle of April. And that's been driven by a combination of e-commerce and debit card use. And then there's been certain categories like food and drug where people have been, basically hoarding paper products and obviously shopping at supermarkets as opposed to going out to restaurants. So we've seen incredible growth in those categories. So and I would also say that the stimulus money, Emily, has played a pretty critical role between the federal stimulus money, the unemployment checks that people have gotten. We've seen a lot of that drive some of the spending increases and some of the recovery. But it truly is mixed because we'll have to see where unemployment goes and whether some of these businesses like restaurants can open at full capacity.
Now, just like work from home has accelerated some technological shifts that would happen in terms of productivity, you're also seeing some technological shifts happening when it comes to payments. What are the shifts that you're seeing on your end that, could potentially be here to stay?
Well, the single biggest is the adoption of e-commerce. And there's been a tremendous amount of first-time activators in e-commerce over the course of this 25 or so week period of COVID-19 descending upon the United States. A lot of people shopping in various new categories. A lot of people doing an online payment and then going to pick up the item at a store or at a restaurant. We've seen a tremendous impact in increase in people ordering food online and then going to pick it up in person. We've also seen the contactless use go up tremendously. People are concerned about currency being something that can carry germs. And we still have $18 trillion spent on cash and check in the world, and we're seeing incredible adoption of contactless. Now, outside the United States, nearly 2/3 of face-to-face transactions are tap to pay. And during the pandemic, we worked with 55 different governments around the world where they actually raised their limits in terms of the amount of a transaction that would be allowed to be utilized in tap to pay. And that's driven a tremendous amount of volume. So tap to pay is here to stay. And, but for the U.S., which is behind.
Right. The U.S. is pretty dramatically behind other countries when it comes to contactless payments. How far behind and how long before we catch up? I mean, this can have huge consequences, especially in a pandemic when that technology is very, very useful.
Interestingly, from the beginning, the U.S. has been behind, but it is making great strides, particularly in the last year or so, and particularly more particularly in this last 6 months of the pandemic. We now have seen 80 million new cards be put in the marketplace in the first 6 months of this year that are enabled for tap to pay. And we expect by the end of the year to have 300 million cards in the marketplace. And that's out of a little less than probably about 1 billion cards in the US. 85 of the top 100, 255 of the top 300 sellers are already enabled for tap to pay. And 9 of the 10 top banks in the United States are pushing it. So today we're probably in the mid-single digit range. And that's kind of where everybody else started out. But it starts to take off once you kind of get to about a 10% level. It really starts to take off, and you can start to see 3 to 5 percentage points increase each quarter. So I expect the U.S. to play pretty fast catch up here, driven in part by the pandemic.
Meantime, Visa was rolling out tap to pay across New York City buses and subways. But of course, since the pandemic hit, you've got the transit system in dire financial straits. I imagine it's the same in other cities. Could that technology be on the top chopping block if mass transit is bound to rebound more slowly than every other industry potentially? Is that one place where this technology moves more slowly?
I don't think so. The reality is that this is generally a very positive thing for transit authorities. Obviously, transit authorities have been hammered now with very few people actually going to work and fear that you can't socially distance in a subway or bus or a train. But where we had put it in place, and we were in discussions or in place with probably 250 different transit authorities around the world, people were finding it to be convenient. It takes the transit authority out of the business of having to create their own cards. This is a much better arrangement for organizations like the MTA, but clearly the MTA has lots of challenges because of ridership being down. But look, I expect all of this to return to some form of normal at some point. It's just a matter of when that's going to be. But it's certainly depressing the number of transactions we're seeing that happen when people commute to work every day. But a lot of that's being made up by people staying home and getting on their computer or their iPad and shopping via e-commerce.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, the U.S. has had a thriving cash economy, and it's still sometimes baffles me how many people still pay with cash. Do you think that changes post-COVID? Do we see a lot less cash changing hands, or do old habits just take too long to die?
Well, we're seeing some of it already. I have probably seen I haven't been out a tremendous amount myself. I've tried to be careful, but I've seen a number of merchants actually have signs up that they will only take cash. I know when getting takeout food, people don't want to accept cash. You've got to either do it online on their website or on the phone, give them a card number. They won't accept cash. And so I'm already seeing a fairly big shift, and I think that shift will be much more of a permanent shift as people get concerned on one hand about whether cash that trades hands multiple times a day can be the source of germs, but also people are realizing it's quite easy, in fact, easier to do a digital payment and not have to worry about carrying cash or having enough cash.
Interesting. Now, Visa was a major sponsor for the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, obviously professional sports, many huge sporting events not happening as planned, some of them slowly starting to come back in fits and starts. How big a setback is that in terms of marketing, advertising, and sponsorship opportunities?
Well, it's certainly a setback. Look, sports are one of the great uniters of people around the world. And we at Visa have only sponsored these big global entities, the NFL, the FIFA World Cup, and the Olympics. So it's certainly disappointing for them and disappointing for us and other sponsors that we can't leverage that asset at this particular point in time. But certainly safety of consumers and citizens comes first. The other reality is, though, regardless, we would be cutting back on our marketing at a time like this anyway, because there's not a lot, people are going to spend what they have to spend, but there's not a lot of discretionary spend going on, very little travel going on. So we would naturally be cutting back on our marketing anyway. So the fact that we're not doing the marketing through these sponsorships as much is okay. Probably an okay aspect of things at this point.